Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm looking at UK political parties in context, which is section 2.4 of component 1 for EDEXCEL A Level Politics. And I'm doing this one now because I realised I'd missed it out, and it's important because it's in the advanced information in 2022. So 2.2 UK political parties in context, and the bullet points on this are the development of the multi-party system and its implications for government, various factors that affect party success, explanations of why political parties have succeeded or failed, including debates on the influence of the media. And some of this stuff is also connected to another video I've done, which is my introduction to the political parties, which is on my playlist for component 1 and on my general A-level politics playlist. So there's some really important stuff in this and some interesting stuff to debate. We've got the link to the media, which is really important. We've got the multi-party system idea. So I'm going to dig into some of these debates and hopefully give you some stuff that will be useful in preparing you for your working class and for your exams, and just to catch your interest, hopefully, in some quite interesting knockabout stuff in politics. So first of all, we're going to look at, do we have a multi-party system? Well, there are various arguments for and against. So if we look at some of these, you could say, well, yes, in some recent elections, especially 2010 and 2015, a significant percentage of voters backed smaller parties, and those smaller parties then had a big impact. However, on the other side, we could say, well, even in those years, the Labour Party and Conservative Party combined won a vast majority of the votes. And actually, first past the post system doesn't translate votes into seats. So, for example, we see the Conservative Labour dominance of the vote rising in 2017. And then in 2019, to show that kind of lack of impact of first past the post, we can see that the Liberal Democrats received 11.5% of the vote, but only 1.7% of the seats. So they saw, for example, going from 2017 to 2019, a far more significant increase in their vote and their share of the vote than, say, the Conservatives did. But the Conservatives were the big winners, and the Liberal Democrats lost a seat, which was the seat of their leader. So in this, we can see, well, that actually there's some real barriers to any significant change with the parties. Again, for example, another example, this would be the Green Party, which for their one seat in the House of Commons has received over 800,000 votes across the country. We saw even more marked stuff than that with UKIP, for example, that had over 4 million votes on one seat. So it looks in that way. You could say, well, actually, yes, we see smaller parties making up reasonable percentage of votes in elections, but actually it doesn't really transform into seats. Therefore, the Labour / Conservative dominance continues. However, in parts of the UK, especially Scotland, parties other than Labour and the Conservatives have significant power. So therefore, what we're seeing is an increase in multi-party competition. In Scotland, in 2021, we saw the SNP win 64 of the 129 seats in the Scottish Parliament, and we saw them with an agreement with the Greens, who had 6 seats, gaining an overall majority combined in the Scottish Parliament. So there we've got a government that doesn't involve either of the major two parties, and actually, if you add the combined seats of Labour and Conservatives together, they don't get to the same number as the SNP. So this really does look like a multi-party system. So it might not be a multi-party system as in we've got 3-4 way kind of tender hooks in terms of the vote in a general election, but you've got to see the significance of the vote in other parts of the country, which suggests there are other parties having a real impact in British politics. Again, a counter to that would be that, well, actually the most important elections are the UK general elections, and in those the Labour Party or the Conservative Party either form a government by themselves or they're in a coalition and they are the senior party, again suggesting their continued dominance. In other elections, local elections, European elections, when we had them, smaller parties have made really significant progress. So we saw this with UKIP and the Brexit Party. We've seen it with the Greens. In 2022, the council elections saw major gains for the Liberals, gaining 224 council seats, and the Greens gaining 79. So they both made very significant gains. The Liberals made considerably bigger gains than the Labour Party, for example. So, although the Conservative Party were the big losers at the council elections in 22, the Labour weren't the big winners. The big winners were some of the other parties, notably the Liberals. In the elections in Northern Ireland, then we see an election with the absence of the big two parties. We've seen in the 22 elections the rise of Sinn Féin. So in two of the four nations, we've got the most important parties being something other than Labour and Conservative. So Sinn Féin and DUP in Northern Ireland, the SNP in Scotland. Now, there is a suggestion that actually what we see is that the success of smaller parties tends to be fleeting. They win by-elections, they win seats at council elections, but it just doesn't translate into general election success. And the big examples that you can give of that are the Brexit Party and UKIP. So we've had points, for example, when they were winning more votes in European elections than anybody else, but it never actually transferred into bums on seats in the UK Parliament. And we've seen those parties rise, and we've seen them disappear. We've seen attempt to create a kind of a moderate party in the centre ground party, with people leaving the Labour Party, the Conservatives and the Liberals trying to form a new party, and then that all kind of looked like it was going to be a big force. It fell away. I mean, similar things you can talk about if we go back to the Alliance Party back in the 1980s, where the Social Democrats combined with the Liberals, and again it looked like they were going to be a massive force, and then it dropped, and we went back to the traditional politics of Labour and Conservative. Now, on reflection of this idea of do we have a multi-party system, it's important not to just focus on elections. That they always make a good basis for argument, particularly when you're writing it down and you can remember some election statistics, and it can give you a really good basis of something to build an argument from, build your points from. Well, we can look at some other points as well. So, for example, saying we can argue there is a multi-party system because we see a party outside one of the big two, UKIP, who has an enormous impact on UK politics because they first of all managed to force a referendum on EU membership, and secondly led the charge in the UK voting to leave. So they succeeded on both fronts, having a significant impact. So that's what they aimed to do. They aimed to get a referendum. They got a referendum. Their aim was Brexit. Brexit happened. So they don't need success in Westminster elections to achieve their political aims. The Green Party, you can argue, through raising environmental issues and essentially holding the feet of the other political parties to the fire, have made substantial gains. Not through winning seats, but by actually making the other main parties greener, because they fear losing shares of their vote to the Green Party, and they see that the public opinion in lots of places is leaning towards greener policies, and therefore the main parties have followed suit. Without the emergence of a Green Party, would we have seen that? And again, is that an indication that parties can have an impact beyond the size of their parliamentary party? Against this, we can argue, well, actually, this isn't really the emergence of a multi-party system. What this really is we have a number of parties that essentially act more like pressure groups. So UKIP, Green Party, essentially are not really full-blown political parties. I know the supporters of those parties would very strongly disagree with that, and this is an argument that you could put forward, is that ultimately that you get these parties that are focused on particular issues, a bit like a pressure group, whilst the broad church parties, the Labour Party and Conservative Party, already contain some of these ideas, and they're better able to adopt these ideas and therefore maintain their dominance. So we see that the Conservative Party being kind of torn over Europe, and then kind of almost UKIP turning up, made up their mind and forced them to go in a particular direction. And so ultimately, it's impossible for the minor parties to break the status quo, because just what happens is they end up, whether it's through their own actions or through the actions of the major parties, being more like a pressure group, because the big party just takes on their ideas and goes, looks like that bit's really, really popular. We'll use a bit of that, and we've already got the party base, we've already got the supporter base that we can exploit and turn that into electoral success. So hopefully those arguments will help you think about whether we have a multi-party system and the extent to which it has emerged. So it could be a question directly about whether we have one. It could be a more complex question about the extent to which it has developed over time. It could even be the idea that maybe it's in decline, that maybe the idea of a multi-party system in the UK has kind of had its day. Now, one of the other bits in the spec then is about the implications for government. Well, we have seen implications for government of the multi-party system. We saw the coalition 2010 to 2015. We've seen the Competence Supply Agreement between the Conservatives and the DUP 2017 to 2019. And there are arguments we might see something along the similar lines again at the next election. That you can argue again, this would suggest that the multi-party bit hasn't gone away, because if you look at the big gains in 2022, they were the Liberals and the Greens did well, Conservatives did badly, but there was no sign really in the Labour Party showing that they were in a position where they would be able to take power by themselves. The other bit, the other implication is kind of one I've already touched on. This is just writing about it in a different way, really. What a multi-party system allows is for new ideas to enter the political arena, be this Greens pushing environmental issues, UKIP pushing the idea of a referendum on leaving the EU. And therefore, what we get is we get a more vibrant and set of ideas, or a more vibrant environment in government, because there are more points of being put across. So, for example, SNP success in recent years means that we have this constant different voice from Scotland, which we hear at Prime Minister's Question Time, and we hear in the Commons, and the idea again of Scottish independence. We hear about it a lot more because we have another voice that's saying it. If we just had dominance, old-style dominance of the Labour Party and Conservative Party, we wouldn't be hearing that on such an amplified level as we are now. Now, at times, the major parties kind of lose control of the political narrative. So if you have a two-party system, then essentially, and the press does tend to fall into this, and a lot of us fall into this, is, well, what does Labour say and what does Conservatives say? And so we've got a Conservative government, and they decided they're going to do this, and this is what the Labour Party would say. But actually, that kind of let's pick between these two and what the two are saying, that narrative can collapse. So Cameron was pushed into the Brexit vote due to the electoral threat of UKIP, and then essentially Cameron lost control of the political narrative at that point, despite the fact that he was Prime Minister, the leader of one of the big two parties, the one that had won an election. We also are seeing now variation across the UK, which is starting to reflect this idea of a multi-party government, because what we see a Conservative response to, for example, COVID in England. We saw the Labour Party's response to it in Wales. We saw the SNP's response to it in Scotland. And so in this, we are seeing a kind of a shift. We're seeing a movement, for example, with the city mayors, and again in that you're getting different voices. Now, a lot of those come out of the major parties, but again in this we see the Scottish example that goes, well, actually we are seeing a different way of doing things and a different voice on how things should be done. We don't just hit through the COVID crisis hear what Labour would do and what the Conservatives will do. We are seeing what the SNP would do because they are enacting it, because they're in control of the Scottish Parliament. Now, one of the most interesting or potentially biggest implications of the development of multi-party government is or multi-party politics is disunion possibly. So we have just seen in both Scotland and Northern Ireland that the parties with the largest share of the vote at the last elections in both those countries don't support the union. So we've got the SNP who want an independent Scotland, and we've got Sinn Féin who want a united Ireland. Now we've already seen minor parties, smaller parties, drive the kind of momentum that eventually led to us leaving the EU. Could it be that we're going to see a momentum created by the smaller parties in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland pushing towards some kind of degree of disunion? The next part I'm going to look at is about the various factors that affect party success. I've come up with 5. You might well have others. So I'm going to look at the strength of party leadership, catching the country's mood, how united or divided a party is, impact of media portrayal, and party funding. Now, one of the difficulties is definitely something I found as I was putting this together is at first you kind of think of this as kind of really distinct areas. But immediately, or almost immediately, you find, oh, well, there's that example, there's that election, I'll use that there. And then you go, oh, yeah, but also there's that one as well. So one of the things to remember is party success and party failure is multi-causal. So a party wasn't just win or lose because it's got a strong or good leader or a bad leader. It's not just it is magically caught the sense of the direction of the major concerns of the mood of the country, because, well, maybe that's what a good leader is. A good leader is someone who can essentially read the room, knows the direction people want to go. Again, you go, well, that party's going to lose because it's horribly divided. Well, if it's horribly divided, is it horribly divided because it's got weak leadership? The media will seemingly absolutely go at certain politicians, and you could probably I've come up with some examples. You can probably come up with more. Well, do the media really go at those politicians and give them a really hard time because they are symbolic of a disunited, chaotic party? They are a weak leader. They are pushing policies that don't meet the country's mood, and the media reflects the people. So does the media reflect the people, or does it lead them? So party funding, well, you can look at that, and there are winners and losers in terms of party funding, but ultimately, is that going to determine an election above and beyond the other elements that we're looking at? So I would say it's a sensible approach to anything that talks about party success is some kind of judgment that's going to argue, well, there are multiple different bits in this that are interconnected, and build some kind of nuanced answer out of that. So if we look at the strength of party leadership. So the orthodox in this goes, voters tend to respond to leaders with clear and positive views about what they will do. So most recent example, we could talk about Johnson and his oven-ready Brexit. And he talked very positively about the UK's future and had a very clear plan on what he was going to do. And the Labour Party didn't really know what it was going to do, and Johnson won the election. And even in that, the Liberals did better than they had done before. They had a clear idea what they were going to do. It wasn't as popular an idea as what Johnson wanted to do, but we saw both those two parties gain, and we saw the Labour Party drop off. You can go back to 97, and you can talk about Blair's positive programme. So he had a series of things that he wanted to reform. We've got the things can only get better anthem. And there was a kind of a buzz about him as a leader, as someone who had new ideas and was going to take the Labour Party in a different direction, and if given the chance, the UK in a different direction. Now, we see, if we go back to 79, we see Thatcher's promise to sort out the trade unions following the winter of discontent, this idea of her as a strong leader who had tough rhetoric on dealing with the economic problems the UK had. And that, again, would help, you can see, as part of helping her win the 79 election. With all of those bits, I would say, well, these things helped, but they aren't by themselves. It's not just that Blair and Johnson were seen as good, strong leaders, and same with Thatcher. There were other things playing a part. Equally, you can explain party failure. So if you've got leaders who have proven to be ill-equipped to deal with difficult issues, they tend to fail. So Brown, who built his reputation on kind of his ability to manage the economy, falls following the financial crisis of 2008. We saw Callaghan in '79 attacked with the slogan "Labour isn't working," so he was seen to have not dealt with the trade unions, not dealt with the winter of discontent. We can see sometimes the impact of leadership being mitigated to an extent if we don't have a standoutly strong or positive leader of either of the major parties. And when neither of them are viewed hugely positively. I mean, I think a good example of this is 2017 with May versus Corbyn. It did lead to a minority government, and there wasn't a clear winner in that. And I think, I mean, there was a lot of people who didn't trust Corbyn. There was a lot of people who were put off by May strong and stable. So ultimately, May won more votes, but I don't think you would take May's victory as it was in 2017 as an indication of her overwhelmingly strong leadership. And if you were looking at it to use it as an indication of Corbyn's poor leadership, well, he actually won a decent proportion of the vote. I mean, obviously the conclusions you draw from 2019 are very different. We also see examples of leadership which are outside the major parties. So, for example, the leadership of Nicola Sturgeon has taken the SNP to new heights. So that's another interesting case study on the impact that leadership can have. And the next election will be a really interesting one. Will Partygate and the standards scandals and the cost of living crisis, will this destroy Johnson's appeal at the ballot box? Can Starmer win the public over? I mean, a Beergate might scupper all of that. Will either or neither of them survive long enough for us to test either of that and find out? So leadership is an interesting one. The media tends to jump on it, and it's all again, it's important we look at this through the filter of the media. The media loves leaders that make a good story. Whether that is overwhelming. I mean, one of the bits frustrating to me as someone who understands the political system is talking to people who are maybe slightly less obsessed with it than I am, who will say, "Oh, I voted for Johnson, or I voted for Corbyn, or I voted for May, or I voted for Blair, or whatever it is." And you're thinking, unless you moved around to lots of different constituencies, you didn't. But I think because the media focuses on the leaders, I think maybe you could argue increasingly the popularity or lack of it, of the leader of the parties is likely to have a very, very big impact on the share of the vote that they have, be that negative or positive. Now, the next bit I've done, I've called it catching the public mood. Now part of this is to me, it makes fairly common sense. If a party is in line with the views of the people, they win elections because we're a democracy and that's how it works. And we do see examples where you can say, well, actually, that party did quite skillfully, or just because it's their ideology, aligned itself with the concerns of the people of that particular point in time. And often this can come, for example, after a long period of the other party being in government. If a party is out of step with what the public are interested in and what they care about, then they won't do very well. If they're seeing that they can't be trusted on something that the public care about, they won't do very well. So, for example, in '97, the Labour Party was aligned with widespread concern over the state of public services, education, NHS, things like that. And they were offering investment in those areas. They were offering improvement. Whilst they were the things that the public were talking about, the Conservative Party was obsessed with Europe, which people weren't. And so, in '97, Labour win by this gigantic majority of 179. In 2015, the public was concerned on the economic problems. So there'd been the financial crisis, and there was austerity and all the hangover from that. And the Conservatives positioned themselves as the safe pair of hands that would keep things stable and stop it all falling to pieces again. And that worked. And they went from being the leader of a coalition to being in sole power. In 2017 and 2019, you can argue that the Labour Party offered a program that was popular with its members, but was too radical for the majority of the country, and therefore they were outside the public mood. They were saying things or offering programs that the public weren't happy or confident in. In 2019, Johnson offered to end the back and forth over Brexit and actually sort it out. And actually, for a lot of people, whether they'd initially been one side or other on that's just what they wanted. They wanted it to go away. They were fed up of it dominating politics and the TV and everything else that was going on, and wanted other things to happen. And so that played into Johnson's success in 2019. They kind of caught the mood of, like, enough's enough, let's just get this done. In 2015, you can look at the collapse of the Lib Dems and say, well, this is largely down to Nick Clegg very badly getting the mood of his voters completely wrong over tuition fees, though he was sorry. And there's a wonderful song on YouTube about that, where someone's auto-tuned it and he sings about it. But again, that's a bit where essentially the Liberal Democrats have gone through a period of crisis because they made a set of decisions which maybe fitted with their leadership, but were out of step with the people who voted and got them to the point where they were a significant force. And we've seen them fall away quite significantly since, but there might be signs of recovery. The SNP are kind of the other side of that. The SNP, which again were very, very small, have over the last 10 years or so really caught the public mood in Scotland, and increasingly so, and therefore won people round onto their side. And in that, they continue to be enormously successful, both in elections to the Scottish Parliament and local elections, but also in Westminster elections. Now, another one, and this is an Old Testament. Again, it's another area the media really, really focuses on. And sometimes I wonder whether this is more of a media issue or one that really makes up people's mind at the ballot box. And it's about how united or divided a party is. Now, it appears that almost without fail, the UK voters punish a divided party. So we've mentioned it already, with the Conservatives, they weren't in step with the public, or you could argue, well, they were divided and therefore they got absolutely hammered. So the Conservatives were divided over Europe in 97. That is one of the reasons why they get destroyed in the 97 election. In the Corbyn era, you can see 2017 and 2019 elections, there was really clear rifts between Corbyn and Momentum and his supporters, so the Corbynistas on one side of the party, and the more moderate wing of the Labour Party, which was predominant within the Parliamentary Labour Party. And you can argue this is what significantly damaged their performance. But was it the infighting between the left of the Labour Party and the moderate part of the Labour Party that destroyed their vote, or was it because Corbyn wasn't a very strong leader, or wasn't perceived as a good leader, or was it because the party failed to capture the mood of what people wanted, particularly, for example, over Brexit? So you've got, in floating in all of this, you've got all those reasons battering around, and your job in terms of writing about things like this is trying to go, well, which one of those do I think played a more important role? So, as I've said, the division over Europe didn't help. They couldn't actually decide their policy on whether there should be a second referendum. Whilst the Conservative Party, when he got to 2019, had put much of its infighting behind them and got behind Boris and his deal. So in 2017, the Labour Party were quite divided. The Conservatives were quite divided. We get a kind of inconclusive result. In 2019, the Labour Party is still divided. The Conservative Party is more united. The Conservative Party wins. That's not to say it was completely united. I mean, there was all the palaver with Johnson kicking kind of the old style Europhiles out of the party, and all that kind of stuff. So there had been problems, but maybe actually at the moment of the election they were more united. Now, political parties do tend to prize unity because it impacts on public perceptions. So essentially, if you haven't got your own house in order, if you can't control your own party, if you don't all agree with each other, what's the chances that you're going to offer me something I will agree with? What's the chances you're going to be able to pull the country together and lead the nation? So public perception and unity tend to be a significant factor. It is always something the media absolutely love. So, for example, Johnson's government was blighted, first of all, during the COVID crisis by leaks, and everything seemed to get out, and everyone knew what was going to happen before it had actually been announced. And then in recent times, particularly over the cost of living crisis and other issues, there has been lots of accusations about Johnson briefing against Sunak and various other members of cabinet briefing against others, and it all looks a bit messy and a bit unpleasant. And if that continues towards the next election, this could potentially damage the Conservative Party's hopes. Not that, for example, the Labour Party without their divisions and stories of disunity as well, particularly between leader and deputy leader. So, if there's a story in it, the media will love to get on that. The fact that we know about the fact that people briefing against each other, and where do all the leaks go? Will they all go through the media? And so maybe what's happening is the media is particularly focusing stuff on, particularly leading on stuff that it thinks will have a bigger impact. And this leads us onto our next one, which is about the media portrayal. And I've got Corbyn at the top looking very grumpy, because he was very grumpy in 2019, and him and other leading members of the Labour Party explained their defeat through the way that Corbyn and the party had been treated in the media. So essentially they accused the newspapers, but also the major TV outlets, including the BBC, of having an anti-Corbyn agenda, and that this agenda had done enormous damage to the parties in at the ballot box, and that they were just being treated unfairly, and therefore there was misinformation being spread. And we see really extreme versions of this, don't we, in America, where you've got Trump, who keeps on going on about how the mainstream media can't be trusted, and that they're lying and all this kind of stuff. So if the media goes for someone, it can have a really big impact. You can go back in time with Labour leaders. You can look at Kinnock, the Welsh windbag, as a lot of the newspapers labelled him, and the press went at Kinnock. We saw it as we go through. I mean, Brown wasn't particularly media friendly. We see it with Miliband. I mean, the infamous, arguably, guy, the way the media and people kept on focusing on his inability to eat a bacon sandwich was as damaging to him as anything else. He was labelled Red Ed, and he wasn't actually enormously left wing. So things like that can have a big impact. It can have a positive impact. So you can get politicians who become kind of darlings of the media. So we had Nick Clegg, who had these really good showing in the debates in 2010, where the other leaders only seemed to be able to say, I agree with Nick. And there was a surge in Liberal support following those debates, though not hugely long-lasting. It seemed to be that you needed a kind of photogenic, media-savvy leader to do well in elections. So Blair seemed to be the person who broke the mold on this for the Labour Party, and then almost like Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats went, that seems to work. Let's create our own clones of that, and we'll do better in elections. And they did. And Cameron was more photogenic and more media savvy than the conservative leaders that had preceded him, and he won elections and they didn't. Now, there does seem to be a thing about, I've used the term here, make good TV, but it doesn't actually have to be TV. It could be headlines, it could be online clips, it could be anything. But there are leaders in the modern day, like Trump and Johnson, who just make good stories. They are almost, above anything else, entertaining. And therefore you get lots and lots of coverage of them in the newspaper and online and on TV and stuff like that, because they will say things that people will like, and they will say things that people hate. So looking at newspapers in Britain at the moment, you'll still have newspapers, things like the Mail, and in particular the Express, that will just complete adulation for anything that Johnson does. And then you'll have others that will just pour scorn on his every move in terms of things like the Guardian and the Mirror. So that kind of divisive figure almost makes better media. And really, actually, in terms of that media battle, and I think this is one that we see this with the culture wars in the States. We're seeing it, I think, increasing in the UK is no one's aiming to win 100% of the vote. You don't need 100% of the vote. You need kind of early 40% of the vote. So it's not necessarily you have to appeal to everyone, but you just have to appeal to enough people. And so that way of capturing the media interest and making sure you're all over the front pages all the time can be really, really important in that. And again, so that kind of media facing way. So maybe not the kind of smooth, savvy Blair and Cameron anymore, but maybe a bit more rough around the edges, a bit more is going to evoke a strong reaction one way or the other. You kind of Trumps and your Johnsons might be the new way. I know party funding is mainly in 2.1, but I think there's some significant issues in this. So, for example, the Conservative Party is supported by business and largely wealthy individuals. So in terms of party funding of the Conservative Party, a few people give a lot. And there have been continuous accusations of scandal, of buying peerages, of Russian money. Newspaper reports recently suggested £2 million since Johnson became Prime Minister has come through from Russian funders, obviously not directly because you can't give to a political party if you're a foreign national. Evgeny Lebedev is a good example of this. So why is this very wealthy person who's very well connected in Russia suddenly got a peerage? Now, on that, this party funding, obviously, you need loads of money to fight elections. And one of the big advantages the Conservative Party have had in recent elections is they have a lot more money than the parties that they are competing against. But negative connotations about where your money comes from can damage a party. Now, it's probably less so from the Conservative Party because people expect their money to come from business and wealthy donors. But things like the Russian connections might have an impact. Traditionally, the Labour Party's money comes from the trade union movement. So what happens then is they pay political subscriptions, and therefore a lot of people give a little. So the Labour Party's funding was massively affected by the drop of mass membership in the 80s and 90s, and also massively impacted by Thatcher's trade union reforms that meant political funds became opt-in, not opt-out. So Labour turned to some wealthy donors, and sometimes this backfired. I think this backfires more when Labour do it in terms of because it's not what people expect. So if they're seen with getting money from Bernie Ecclestone, then he seems to get what he wants, then they look bad and they have to give it back, and he still gets what he wants. So it all goes horribly wrong. And again, there was the idea of dealings for peerages and stuff under Labour as well. Now, some of this was dealt with the return to mass membership under Corbyn. Though the membership was so cheap, it didn't generate probably enough money, really. And it's also declined. So since we moved to the Starmer days, the membership of the Labour Party has dropped by about 200,000. Again, there is a difference in between appeal to membership and appeal at the ballot box, and we'll see how that plays out. So the Labour Party need money to compete with the Conservatives, and they're caught with the dilemma really is rich donors tends to conflict with the ideals of the Labour Party. If they rely on mass membership, then mass membership tends to move the Labour Party to the left, and whenever the Labour Party moves to the left, then they don't tend to win elections unless you're going to go all the way back to the 1940s. And another interesting one in party funding is it fills back into our argument about the multi-party system. The smaller parties just can't compete. And that's particularly if they're trying to compete across the country. So the Lib Dems, they just can't get anywhere near the funding of the big two. So I hope that's been helpful for you. If it has, then please hit like. If you haven't already done, do subscribe. There's over 160 videos covering all different aspects of A-level politics on here. There's also a load of stuff on various bits of history, British history, Russian history, American history. So hopefully, whatever you're interested in, you find something for you. So if you've got any comments, then please leave those below. There's also, for some of you, there'll be the new thanks feature as well. Right, lovely. Thank you very much for watching.